I always found it so idiotic that some people say everything can be explained by using science, when there are things out there that man can't even come close to understanding. Before I begin my story, I think it best to give you some context. I live in an extremely rural part of upstate New York, surrounded by forest on all sides. The closest grocery store is at least 2 miles away. I always enjoyed walking in these woods. The wind blowing through the trees and the general peace of the forest are very relaxing. One night I woke up, and I can instantly tell something wasn't right. Normally, the forest is extremely noisy in the nighttime. I can usually count on the gentle noises of the forest to lull me to sleep when I wake up at night. The crickets and the grasshoppers chirp away. However, tonight was different. Instead of hearing sounds of nature, I heard nothing but an all-encompassing silence. It was so quiet, as if death itself has embraced everything around me. This scared me, as the forest is never this quiet. So I was curious as to why the forest was so unnaturally silent. I got up out of bed and walked to my window, looking outside to see if I could find out what was going on. There, crouching on all fours in my front yard, was a creature that was something out of my worst nightmares. Everything about it was perverted and wrong. Its body was extremely pale. It was also extremely emaciated, and was literally skin and bones. I could see its ribs poking out from under its skin, and its bony hips jutting out from its sides. On either hand was 5 extremely long blood-stained claws. The worst part about the whole thing was its eyes. My God, its eyes. They were completely black and sunken in like 2 deep pits of nothingness. There was no pupil, no retina, just an empty void. Its eyes alone rocked me to my core and caused me to shiver in fear. I was completely paralyzed in terror. I wanted to run. I wanted to scream, to do something, but my body refused to move, no matter how hard I tried. It turned its long neck up to get a good look at me. I couldn't pick out any desirable emotion in its bony, decaying face. The moment our eyes met, I experienced a feeling of intense fear, unlike anything I have ever felt before. It was dread. Dread in its purest form. The feeling washed over me like tides on a seashore. I was completely frozen, like somebody filled my body with cement. I dared not to move an inch, and I prayed it would go away. Then, just when I thought the feeling of fear couldn't get any worse, the thing began to crawl on all fours towards my house. My legs finally decided to work, and in seconds I was running into my parents' room. I babbled incoherently as I told them about the monster outside the house. My father, who was a well-built man, walked confidently down the hall to my room and looked outside as I clung to my mother's leg while he investigated. With a smile on his face, he returned and told me nothing was there, and I probably just imagined it. I tried my hardest to tell him, but I struggled to get out even the simplest of sentences due to how distressed I was. My mother decided it was best to let me sleep with them for the night. Only then did I ever truly feel safe. And I prayed to God I would never see that horrible whatever it was ever again. The next time I saw it, I was 17 years old. At that time, I had almost completely forgotten about the monster I saw outside of my window all those years ago. I can remember waking up one night, the sense of terror and fear and dread so thick and palpable, it felt like the mist hung in the air. I shook with fear, not knowing what was going on. The feeling was a million times worse than before. And then I saw it. Sitting on the edge of my bed. It was the same monster from before. It was just sitting there at my bedside. It twisted its long, hideous neck around 180 degrees to look at me, and it had this demonic smile on its face, revealing razor-sharp, jagged teeth. Its decaying neck cracked several times as it turned its horrifying head to look at me, and I began to shake uncontrollably. Tears fell from my eyes like waterfalls. I was scared and confused. The fear got stuck in my throat and prevented me from screaming for help. Then, it turned the rest of its body around to face me. The monster slowly crawled forward on my bed. Again, I dared not move. A horrible smell filled my nostrils, so disgusting it made me gag. It smelled like death and rotting flesh. The worst part of the whole thing was the morbid, nightmarish grin it had on its face. This thing enjoyed seeing me terrified like this. It savored my terror, and it drank in my fear. I didn't know what to think. I didn't know what to do. My mind desperately tried to find a logical way to explain this, but I found none. It stood over me and looked right into my eyes. I could feel my sanity slowly being eaten away the longer it looked at me. The dread was so intense, it felt like it was going to become ingrained into my very being. I shook harder than before, the tears streaming down my face. Never before in my entire life have I had a true primal feeling of fear and dread. The smile widened on its lips as it noticed my terror. I wanted to run, I wanted to hide, but my body was petrified, unable to move an inch. It felt like my heart was going to beat right out of my chest. Whatever this thing was moved closer and closer to me until its face was less than 6 inches away from mine. Then 3 words escaped its degraded lips. "Always with you," it whispered in a hoarse, gravelly voice. It didn't even sound human. It sounded like a monster trying to imitate human speech, if that makes any sense. I turned my head left to right and tried to tell it to go away, but no words came out of my mouth. The dread traveled down my spine like lightning as it looked me dead in the eyes. Looking into this thing's face was like looking into hell itself. It was full of nothing but fear and hatred. My mind ran through a million different scenarios of how it would kill me. I knew this is the night that I would die. My entire life has led up to this moment. Looking at this thing made me feel like my soul was going to get sucked right out of my mouth. In what felt like hours, the creature continued to stare at me with the black, soulless eyes. My mind is not going to last much longer. I could feel my subconscious slowly fading into insanity the longer it looked at me. Its hot, disgusting breath hit my face, causing me to gag. Then, with inhuman speed, it ran across my room and jumped out of my window, 2 stories to the ground. I gasped for air, the feeling of dread still hanging on me like a noose. I couldn't fathom why it didn't kill me. It had every opportunity to do so, but it didn't. The few minutes of that night are now permanently ingrained on my subconscious. No matter how hard I try, the painful memories never fully went away. I spent the next few years in a prison of isolation I have crafted for myself. I couldn't get that damn thing out of my head. It's like death was hanging over me at every hour of the day, waiting to strike me down. The public was ignorantly unaware of the danger that loomed over them all. The worst part of all of it was that I was the only one who truly understood what was really out there, what was waiting for us in the dark. I didn't bother telling my parents. There was no way they could possibly understand the living hell I was forced to endure. Fear and intimidation became my only bedfellows. In some ways, the after effects of it were far worse than my actual encounter with that monster. I fell into a deep depression, paranoid that that thing was going to come back for me one day. What the hell was it waiting for? I decided to take the initiative and search for the creature online. I eventually found what I was looking for on a website called creepypasta.wikia.com. The picture they had on the website looked near identical to the monster I saw that fateful night. It's called the Rake. It often slowly drains the sanity of its victim before inevitably killing the person. More often than not, the Rake always wins in the end. Anyone who sees it usually doesn't live to tell about it. This information only further ground death into my heart. I knew I didn't have much time left. I contemplated suicide several times during the following months. I tried to slit my wrists on more than one occasion. I didn't want to give this thing the chance to kill me. My parents became very concerned about my well-being and signed me up for therapy in the closest town they could find. I never felt as if any of the people there really understood me. None of them could comprehend the pure and utter terror I've experienced. Despite my protests, I was forced to keep going, and eventually they managed to convince me that it was all some kind of vivid nightmare. Even though I knew deep down there was no way a nightmare could be that real. But still, I managed to convince myself otherwise. This was the best thing for me at the time. Facing the demon that haunted my subconscious is much harder than pretending it doesn't exist. My mental condition and my health drastically improved over time. I even managed to make some new friends. Sometimes, I felt like I was being watched when I was outside, but I managed to convince myself it was all in my head. Then one night, reality hit me like a cold slap to the face. I can remember it quite vividly. I was 19 years old at the time, and I was staying at the house while my parents attended a dinner party. I sat in a rocking chair in the living room, enjoying the time to myself. My parents went to a dinner party and allowed me to stay home. I sat down to read the H.P. Lovecraft Ultimate Collection. I'd grown quite fond of his work over recent years. All of a sudden, a familiar feeling of dread and fear overtook my body. I knew what it meant. There was no mistaking it. The Rake had returned. The forest outside silenced itself out of combination of fear and respect. I grabbed my head with both hands, desperately trying to force the memories back down. When I opened my eyes, there it stood, directly in front of me, about 3 meters away. No, you're not real, I screamed in denial, and yet, in spite of what my therapist told me, there it stood. I once again stared into the black, lifeless eyes. I could hardly believe what I was seeing. Standing straight up, I managed to get a good look at its sick, perverted mockery of a human body. It was long and lanky, with its arms stretching down to its knees. It was built like a basketball player. A pungent odor filled my nose as I watched it walk up to me. My body shook as an intense fear overtook the entirety of my being. It was huge, its head nearly scraping the top of the ceiling. It slowly lumbered towards me with an evil, maddening smile on its face. All the hard work I've done to convince myself this thing doesn't exist was eradicated in an instant. I'd finally come back to reap what it had sown all those years ago. I only had moments left. My fight or flight response took over, and I bolted down the hall. I ran as fast as I could to my dad's room, not once looking behind me as I heard it running after me on all fours. I barely managed to reach my father's room in time. I opened it as fast as I could and closed it behind me, locking it in the process. The rake rammed its body against the door several times, trying to break it down. I ran to my father's bedside as fast as I could and crouched down, reaching under the bed. I found what I was looking for. My dad always keeps his hunting rifle under his bed for safety. I pulled it out from under the bed, unclipped the clamps, and opened it. When I was young, my father taught me how to use a gun. He took me with him sometimes when he went hunting. The rake slammed against the door time and time again. In mere moments, it would break it in two. I pulled back the lever and saw the gun was loaded. "Perfect!" I shouted. I put the hammer back in position and got up off the ground, determined to kill this thing once and for all, finally ending the nightmare that plagued my life for all these years. I held the gun up to where I thought it would be standing and pulled the trigger. The gun went off with a deafening crack, damn near blowing out my eardrums in the process. The only thing I heard at the moment was the loud ringing in my ears. All at once, the banging noises stopped and all was still. The room became filled with an eerie silence. Is it dead? I thought to myself. I ran back to the bedside and put another bullet from the box in the chamber and loaded it. I needed to check if I killed it. This gun can make quick work of any deer. I very slowly opened the door, centimeter by centimeter, until I saw what was on the other side. The monster took deep, exasperated breaths in and out as it clutched its chest in pain, laying on the ground. Dark red blood dripped from the bullet wound in its chest and trickled onto the floor. I then lifted the gun up and aimed it at its head, determined to finish it once and for all. But before I could fire, the rake lashed out and swung its claw, slashing me across the face. My head erupted in excruciating pain. It had cut through flesh and reached down to the bone. The beast then ran off down the hall and smashed straight through the sliding glass door leading into the woods. The wound on my face was heavily bleeding at this point, and my body began to go numb. My mind started to fade into blackness. The last thing I remember was looking at the broken portion of the sliding glass door and the trail of blood it left. I woke up in the hospital, where my mother and father were waiting anxiously for me to wake beside my bed. Then I noticed there was a massive bandage on my face that covered the right side of my head. "Son, are you all right?" my dad asked. "How did this happen?" Mom cried with concern. I then told him the full story about the rake breaking into the house and attacking me. I could tell my family was skeptical by the looks on their faces. Regardless, they said they believed me. I think they only said that, though, to calm me down. To this day, I'm sure they still doubt the validity of my story. My wound did eventually heal, after getting 40+ stitches. And while my physical wounds may mend, I don't think I will ever be able to get over the emotional trauma that thing caused me. I can still see him staring at me in my dreams. These events are something I will have to carry with me the rest of my life, whether I like it or not. As soon as I became old enough, I moved as far away from that town as humanly possible. I moved to Santa Barbara, California. Everyone here was very nice and welcoming, which helped to heal some of my suffering. But the feeling of paranoia still stuck with me. It doesn't matter where I go, I never feel completely safe. Somehow, I get the feeling that one night, I may find him again by my bedside, waiting for me.